You know our channel is more than just about cooking. It's about life. It's about history. And we are so fortunate here at the Lazy T Ranch today to have our good friend Clay Gibbons come in here, a Wyoming historian who is going to share with us the history that really went on in this great state.
When you look at Wyoming's history, Spring Creek Raid, the conflict between the cattlemen and the sheepmen, that culminated in the loss of 3 sheepmen and other men being sent to prison and one sentenced to die, to be hanged by the neck until dead. All that conflict happened right here on the Lazy T Ranch. I'm Clay Gibbons. I've been born and raised here in the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, near Worland all my life. It's just been a wonderful place to live because there's so many historical things that I've been able to uncover firsthand, and it's just been an exciting life doing that. And I love to share the history of Wyoming with other people. Well, Tensley, Wyoming is located on the eastern edge of what's the Bighorn Basin. And the Bighorn Basin is the largest amphitheater completely surrounded by mountains in the world. And the story is that the Indians, when they traveled through here in the old times, would come from the central part or the southern part of Wyoming, and they were headed to Montana. And on their trip, they had a rendezvous site where they would stay for a number of days. That site happened to be Tensley, Wyoming, and the reason it got its name is inside a cave, the Indians had put in 2 imprints of hands with a teepee. So when you read it in Indian Sign Language, it was 10 sleeps. And they would stay about 10 days there in a rendezvous and recuperate and get their horses all fed up before they would head out over the mountain towards Montana. Just on the other side of the mountains from here was the Hole-in-Wall country, and that was Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid's famous hideout. And then they would cross over the Bighorns and come into Thermopolis, which is the southern end of our Bighorn Basin. That was always that whole area is called the Outlaw Trail, where they would traverse. This beautiful area we're in right here that Lazy T now operates is very significant in Wyoming's history. The interesting thing that happened in this part of the country was that when sheep were brought into this country, actually sheep came into this country back in the 80s, and the cattlemen hated sheep. They had great animosity against sheep. They believed that sheep would graze the grass too short and it wouldn't regrow for good pasture for cattle. They also thought that if they went to the reservoir to drink, that the stench that the sheep would leave behind would keep the cattle from going for the water to drink. There were several sheep raids around the country, and by sheep raids, they would raid a sheep camp, destroy the sheep wagon, scare the hell out of the sheep herder, and kill some sheep. But they did a lot of those things around this area and all over Wyoming to try to tell the sheepmen that we don't want you here. This particular area, though, the sheepmen, or the cattlemen, actually went a step further. They actually drew a line on a map, several lines, that said, this is cattle country only. Sheep are not allowed. One of the men that did that was a guy by the name of Joe Emge. He finally talked to some relatives of his from Illinois to come out and buy his ranch. And after they did, he's walking around with a pocket full of money. And he decides, how am I going to spend this money? He determined that the best investment would be sheep. So he got involved with another man by the name of Joe Alamand. And they decided to buy 5,000 head of sheep. And those sheep were brought down into the Bighorn Basin, down by Worland, where I live. And they wintered there the winter of 1908, 1909. And they had every intention of coming up here because Joe Alamand's ranch is on this place where we're sitting right now. Joe Emge was a trader. He helped establish the deadline, and then he had the gall to buy in with Alamand 5,000 head of sheep to bring right up in the middle of the deadline country. The ranchers got together, and as they camped 4 miles away from this place, just down the creek from here, they camped there, and the invaders, the raiders, the Spring Creek Raiders, 7 of them came over. They had masks over their face. One of them had a flour sack mask with holes cut in the eyes. It was a Friday night, and it was a full moon. It happened to be Good Friday. But anyway, they attacked the camp, and in the end, they killed 3 sheepmen and burned 2 of the bodies inside the sheep wagon. So it was a disastrous thing. It was one of the largest events in Wyoming's history next to the Johnson County War, which happened just over the mountain. It raised hell all the way to Washington, D.C. After the 3 men were killed, their bodies were brought up, and they were buried here on this ranch. The 3 graves in the cemetery on this ranch are the graves of Joe Alamand, who was the man that owned the ranch here, and then his nephew from France, Jules Lazier, and Joe Emge, who was a cattleman turned sheepman. Of the animosity that was around between the cattlemen and sheepmen at that time, the Spring Creek Raid was the last major conflict. And it was the most deadly conflict between the cattlemen and sheepmen. I remember being 8 years old and driving with my dad. We sold tractors and farm equipment, so I'd ride with him every chance I get. We're driving south of Tensleep when we crossed the sign that says Spring Creek. And I remember asking him, so Dad, where did this Spring Creek raid happen? And back then we didn't have air conditioning, the window was down. He waved his hand out and he said, well, somewhere over there, son. And I remember at 8 years old going, what do you mean somewhere over there? Somebody's got to know where that happened. 1988, I came upon the original trial manuscript of the Spring Creek raid. And I knew there had to be a map that gave that information. So then I was on a mission. So I go up as the county clerk. First she said, wait a minute. And she jumps up and goes in another room. She comes back with this book. And I knew the surveyor's name because he surveyed it shortly after the raid because it was used, this is the information they used in trial. And she hands me this book and it literally fell open to his survey of the Spring Creek raid. And at that moment I thought, Clay, you've got everything you need to find out for that little 8-year-old boy where that site was. So I came out with professional surveyors and we resurveyed, and that day I stood on the site of Joe Element, where Joe Element's body lay. So I got a hold of the State Historic Preservation Office and told them the story and what I found, the location, and they said, hey, that's great, Clay. You're on your own because we have no money. And so then I was on a mission to raise money and get the sign made, and I was able to have the sign made, have monuments made at where the north wagon was and the south wagon was. So to me, what that means is being able to preserve part of the West. And part of the West, to me, means a culture. It's a culture of being neighborly. It's a culture of the relationships that families have with their wives, with their children, with their Lord. And it's a culture that comes out of being a pioneer. In 1989, when I dedicated the sign, that was the 80th anniversary, I knew at that time that 20 years from this day, I'm going to be back here with my sheep wagon parked on the exact spot. I just knew that was going to happen, had to happen, right? So 20 years later, I brought my youngest daughter. She's 10 years old. She came out with me, and the local folks wanted to do a little recreation. So we actually had some raiders ride up that night with masks on. And that night after everybody left, I had the sheep wagon parked there, and Bailey and I were the only ones left. And I had a dog, old Ace was just a puppy then, little border collie dog. And when Joe Element's body was found the next morning, it had snowed that night, and their little border collie pup was lying on his chest for warmth. And here I had my border collie pup there too. That was kind of touching. Went in the sheep wagon, and I cooked up a little grub for Bailey. We had dinner, and finally at the appropriate time, that it would have been 100 years to that hour, to within a few minutes of when those raiders came up to that camp, knelt down in the moonlight and hollered out, strike a light. And then they counted 1, 2, 3, and they started rapid gunfire in that sheep wagon. I said, honey, you stay here. I took my 30-30 out with me, and I walked over to the exact spot on that hill where Herbert Brink knelt on the ground and hollered out,
strike a light.
And then I fired 3 rounds out of my 33 over the top of the sheep wagon. And I tell you, the hair on the back of your neck stands up, and you really get a feeling. It really chokes you up. Things 100 years ago, the sound of that gunfire bouncing around was just the same as it is right now. Took me a little bit to catch my breath. I went back in the sheep wagon, and then we crawled up in bed and said, honey, we gotta get some sleep. Crawled up there and talked a little bit more, and she finally said, well, good night, Daddy, I love you. And I said, I love you too, sweetheart. We turned and looked out the window of the sheep wagon. And in the sky was this emerald green shooting star that came slowly across the sky. Boom! Just exploded. And we were speechless. And it was quite a while before we wanted him to say something. Finally, Bailey says, Daddy, did you see that? I said, yeah, I did, honey. She says, I think the 3 Joes were telling us thank you for not forgetting us. Yeah, I think so too, honey. Any of those of you that are out there that would like to hear a little more Wyoming history, I've got a podcast I've been doing for the last number of years. It's called The Sweet Smell of Sagebrush. And in it you'll find several of my stories that are related, and just the one we just talked about
The West really does live on out here in America like this, and we're so glad to be able to share it with you, and we hope that y'all continue to make the West alive again. But it is with pride and honor and great privilege that I tip my hat to all the servicemen and women, all the veterans who have kept that old flag flying over camp. But hey, if you missed some of these videos that we've been shooting on this Wyoming series, be sure and check out that playlist because you don't want to miss them all. Rest of you, get up in here close. I'm going to give you a big old hug. God bless you, each and every one, and we'll see you down the trail.